Hey everybody, welcome back. In today's video, we will be discussing compressors, what they are, what each component within a compressor does, how they're typically used, and some of the applications for that. We'll touch a little bit on limiters, which is really a variety of compressor, but I want to save that for its own video. So yeah, let's jump right into it. First things first, what is a compressor? What does it do? A compressor is a piece of hardware or software that reduces the dynamic range of audio. So if we think of audio on a scale, let's say absolute quietest that the signal is going to be to the absolute loudest that the signal is going to be, what a compressor is going to do is take whatever the input is coming in and reduce it to a defined level. Now that could be reducing by taking all the very, very loud stuff and bringing it down. It could be bringing the loud stuff down a little bit and bringing the floor up, and it could be any number of things in the middle there. But what you're doing is you're taking a very wide piece or a very wide dynamic range, and you're reducing it to your desired level. And there's all kinds of applications from, strictly utility, also to kind of coloring of sound. And we'll cover those as we get into it. But first things first, let's see what a typical compressor on a channel looks like. We'll go to the handy SSL channel. So this is what a typical compressor is going to look like. Actually, you know what? Let's use a different one, and we'll come back to that one. So this is a compressor with all of the bells and whistles made available to you. There's a whole lot of stuff here. Can be a little bit intimidating the first time you see it, but I assure you, once you get used to what each item does, then it's easy to make sense of it. So the first thing we want to do is figure out how it turns on, right? How does a compressor know what to compress? That is going to be from this right here, the threshold, if you can see my mouse. What the threshold is a point on the in the dynamic range where the gain reduction unit in a compressor, which is the actual thing that turns the volume down, that's the point at which it activates. So you can see here we have dBFS set up as our metering here, and if we have the threshold, nothing changes right here just yet, and we'll explain why in a second. But we do see this little fader moving. This is just a different representation of where that threshold takes place. You'll see why that makes sense in a second, but that is to say, if your threshold is set at 0 dBFS, then you're never going to be compressing anything, because the point at which you're telling the compressor to start bringing stuff down is the very, very top. And if you're clipping, that might be a little handy, but in general, it's going to be somewhere below that. We're going to set it, for the sake of illustration, at negative 20 dBFS for right now. So we've told the compressor, okay, for any signal coming through, if it's below 20 dBFS, then don't do anything to the signal. If it hits 20 dBFS and goes above that, then I want you to turn it down. So that's what threshold does. Tells you where that gain reduction unit activates. Okay, well, you've told it to turn down. The next logical question is, cool, how much do you want me to turn the level down? And that's where ratio comes into play. Right now, And this may be a little bit difficult to see, but this is 1.00:1. So 1 to 1. That is to say, the way the compressor is currently configured, when an audio signal goes above the threshold, it will be 1 to 1. That is to say, for every 1 dB that goes over that threshold, 1 dB will be allowed through. So essentially, you're not doing anything. You're not compressing it. If we were to turn up that compressor ratio to 2 to 1, now you can see the line graph here doing some work. We can see now that that top end has bent down so slightly. So a ratio of 2 to 1 is that for every 2 dB that the audio gets above negative 20 dBFS, 1 dB will be allowed through. So you're effectively reducing it by a scale of 2 to 1, which sounds like a lot, but in practice, it doesn't make a huge difference. So more frequently, what we'll see is a ratio of like 3 or 4 to 1 being a good starting point. That's the point at which you can really start to hear the compressor take effect. So for every 4 dB of input that are coming through that are going above that threshold, it's allowing 1 dB through. And that number can go up and up and up from there. You can see here we have, we won't do that. We can go up into the double digits here, and it gets pretty crazy in terms of how much it takes. So in this instance, 41.2 to 1. It would take 41.2 dB of gain on that signal past the threshold for the compressor to allow 1 dB over that threshold going outbound. So what a limiter is in dictionary terms, it is a compressor with a ratio that is 10 to 1 or greater. More often than not, where we see limiters being used is at a much higher radio. For instance, radio broadcasters, they want as much gain as they can without clipping, and they want really no dynamic range. They want everything kind of to be loud and in your face because it's being transmitted via airwaves. So you'll almost always see them use what's called a brick wall limiter on the outputs of everything, and that could be set, 20, 30, 40, 50 to 1. In most situations, if you use 3.5 or 4 to 1 as a starting point, then you're going to be in good shape and you can make your adjustments from there. So that's threshold, and that is ratio. Those are two of the I'd say two of the more important ones. These are all important, but this is going to be, kind of the meat and potatoes of the compressor. The next thing I want to talk about is makeup. Makeup is the portion of the compressor that adds gain back to the signal. Now, you might be thinking, well, hey, I thought the goal of this was to, make the loud stuff quieter. Well, kind of, yeah. If you have an acoustic guitar, for instance, where you're strumming, you may have a couple of those strums be very loud, and you want the compressor to catch those and bring them back down. In doing so, the overall level has been affected, and if you want to increase the volume of the overall compressed signal, that's what makeup gain does. So that's gain that's being added after the gain reduction unit has done its work to be able to bring the signal back up to a level. So you can see here on this portion of the screen, as I adjust the makeup gain up and down, that ratio of the line really isn't doing anything. It's just bringing the whole thing up or down. So those are the first three criteria, or the first three categories. We have threshold, which is the point at which the gain reduction unit activates, the ratio, which is essentially how much the gain reduction unit activates, and then makeup, which is how much gain is being added to the signal after the gain reduction unit has reduced gain. Let's see what this sounds like before we start getting into anything else. I'll play a little snippet on piano, and then we will go from there. Okay. So let's take the first part of that, and we'll listen to it with no compressor right off the bat. You know, I'm going to punch in there because I think just that little snippet is going to get annoying pretty quick. It would help if I recorded, wouldn't it? So let's take that very novice piano performance and listen to it without compressor. Third time's the charm. So we can see as the performance goes along here, this little dot moving back and forth shows you where that gain is dBFS. So now let's start to enact some of these. Let's say, so our average there is, it looks like it's right in that negative 15, maybe negative 12 area dBFS. So let's set our threshold to something a little bit lower than that so we can see how it's affected. Let's set it to negative 18. And let's set our ratio. Let's just do this. Let's set our ratio to 4:1. Just to see how that sounds. Fair enough. Okay, so here's what that snippet sounds like with 4:1 compression starting at negative 18 dB. So you can hear it. It definitely sounds different. Let's bypass that and I'll engage it a couple times. So you can see there, the overall range has been reduced. A lot of those really sharp sounding spikes have been brought down, and the whole thing sounds a little bit more flat. I wouldn't say it sounds better, but for the sake of illustration, that's what it sounds like. Let's bring that threshold up now a little bit, and let's see how that affects it. We're going to set the threshold to negative, we're going to go about negative 10. That way it's really only the tops that are getting brought down. Let's see how that sounds. Okay, that automatically sounds better. Now, let's reduce that ratio a little bit. Let's go 3.5 instead of 4 and see if that makes it sound better. I actually think I liked it a little bit more at 4:1, so let's go 4.5. Sure, here it is without. Cool, that sounds good. So we can see here on this bar that is going below 0 what our decibel reduction is. So right now, we're living right about somewhere between 2 and 3 decibels of reduction. So what we can do now that we know that number is we can take our makeup and bring that up. We'll start at just under 3, and now we've have a compressed signal and increase the overall level. So here's what that sounds like. Here it is without. So it is a subtle difference in this context. It just kind of adds a little bit more energy to the performance. It brings up some of the lows and squashes some of the highs of the dynamic level. So that's I'd say the 3 most important components. The next 2 I want to talk about are attack and release. And what this has to do is with time. Attack is how soon after a signal crosses above the threshold that the gain reduction unit begins to take effect. So right now we have attack set to 2, that goes down to 0 and goes up to 1,000. So this is going to be measured in milliseconds typically. Anything 30 milliseconds and faster is considered fast attack. Now it should be noted that if you go absolute fast, 0.01, it's not uncommon to get a little bit of distortion, like a little bit of clicking sounds in there. Let's listen to that at the fastest possible attack on this. So it's actually not too bad there. We're not going crazy and squashing the signal. This is how it sounds with a slow attack now. We're going to take the attack and raise it to 70 milliseconds. So you can see it's not really activating because it's only after the threshold, and it comes back down pretty quickly. So let's set that back to what it was, which is 2 milliseconds. That's a fast attack time. Release is the counterpart to attack. That is how soon after the threshold, or after the signal goes back below the threshold, that the gain reduction unit stops taking effect. So we have it set to 50 right now. It goes as low as 1, and again up to 10,000. So at 50, here's what it sounds like. Oop. And I'm going to crank that up. Now you can see that because the release is set so much higher, you can see it's the gain reduction unit still is working, slowly letting go of the signal, and it'll eventually go back down, but it takes quite a while. So you might think, okay, well, why would I want an attack and release other than immediate, right? Well, in some situations, drums specifically come to mind, you still want that snap, the attack at the beginning of a note or a plosive syllable. We call that the transient. And the 2 things that come to mind are like kick and snare drum, right? You still want that crack of a snare drum. So what you would typically do in that situation is you would set the attack to longer than 30 milliseconds. That's enough time to allow that first really sharp transient to cut through. And then you would go with a relatively fast release after that. If you are doing drum overheads or vocals especially is where it makes a big difference, you want to go fast attack, fast release as a general starting point. Because in that situation, you're not looking for the transient of a voice, you're looking for the overall performance. If you listen to podcasts, it's almost always fast attack, fast release. I must admit, I have a compressor running on my vocal channel right now that is fast attack, fast release, because I don't want a lot of dynamic range. I want everything increased in terms of gain as much as possible without distorting, and I want all of those words that I might not say as loud to be brought up as well. So that is how a compressor works. Let's look at one other situation or one other layout for that. Let's go back to the SSL channel now. So we can see we have the ratio, we have the threshold. This time it's in VU instead of dBFS, which is fine. And we have release here, but we only have a little switch. Fast attack. So by default, it is set to a slow attack because it's assuming it's going to be a drum or some type of transient heavy instrument coming through. If you want that as vocal or drum overhead where you need a faster attack, then you could see that switch over. So it's not uncommon to see specific compressors only give you parts of it because a lot of times outside of the utility of like what we're doing right now with voice, it colors the sound in a very pleasing way, or it adds a little bit of punch to what you're doing. Let's look at another example of a compressor that is somewhat unique. So this is a plugin that's modeled off of the DBX 160. Very iconic compressor. And this, as you can see, has threshold. This has compression, which is ratio, and then it has gain. So this is a fixed attack, fixed release compressor. Very specific uses, used a lot of times with kick drum, with other rock type settings. But the fact of the matter is, you can pull up a bunch of different compressors, especially in the recorded audio world, and you might only see a subset. This is one of my favorite compressors to use on the drum bus channel, kind of like what we talked about in the EQ video. This only has peak reduction, compression, and gain. Everything else is fixed. It doesn't let you touch it. It does its job and it colors the sound in a very specific way, and that's how you use it. So in a live sound setting, you're typically going to have most of, if not all of those settings available to you. In a recorded setting, though, it's not uncommon, especially with boutique gear, to see only specific things. So that is a general rundown of compressors. There's a lot of great videos out there that detail different methods for compression. We'll get into some of those when we cover our channel, or pardon me, when we do our video on routing, busing, and summing, but we won't mess with that for now. For now, just remember that compression is a way to reduce the dynamic range of whatever it is that you are sending through an audio system. So thanks again for watching. We'll see you in the next one.